Oh, hi everybody. So welcome back. Today we're going to talk about focus um, and how to master focus, specifically autofocus, but manual focus comes into this too. So a lot of new photographers will find themselves getting frustrated trying to get the perfect shot, and they find that their images are not tack sharp. Um, so typically, the reason this happens is a lot of new photographers, they want to master the camera, and that's admirable. And they put themselves in manual mode and dial in their own ISO, um, their shutter speed, and depth of field. And the problem generally is the ISO is set too low, and their shutter speed is set too low in most cases. And a lot of times, their lens is also, the depth of field is also set too low. So, here's some quick guidelines on how to master your focus so you get nice sharp pictures, whether you're shooting inside or outside. Now, it's nice to shoot wide open, but when you're first learning, I don't recommend it. Um, you're going to miss a lot of shots. So, what are those settings that you should strive for? You know, what and let me also kind of back up here. Make sure you set up back button autofocus on your camera. That's one item. Item number two, use a tripod or monopod as much as possible. If you don't have a monopod or tripod handy, and monopods are cheap. I know it's been some time, but I have a monopod that cost me $10. Um, and it's just a cheap aluminum thing. And if you don't have a monopod and you don't have the money for that, you can, and you, if you want something really compact, you can take paracord, put a 1/4 inch eye bolt on it, and screw that in. You put a nut on it, screw that into the bottom of your camera, tighten the nut, and make the paracord long enough so you can put your feet through the loop of the paracord, and that'll provide tension, which will help stabilize your camera. Otherwise, see if you can set your camera on something, and if the situation allows for it, use the self timer or a remote shutter release, potentially your phone or iPad, depending on the software of your camera. But back to the primary three things that are going to help you achieve that tack sharp focus. The first one is depth of field. So, as a general rule of thumb, when you're shooting indoors, as long as your lens can accommodate it, shoot at f4 to f5.6. That's the typical normal indoor shooting depth of field that you're going to want. So your depth of field is deep enough that your subject appears to be in focus. Earlier, I talked about this 85mm lens at its shortest focal range, and which is roughly 3 feet. At 3 feet, the depth of field on this is only 6mm. So everything else is out of focus. So if you slightly miss, even if you're on autofocus and it captures the eyelashes instead of the eye, your picture is going to be out of focus because it's only got 6mm. So if you move to f4 or better, f5.6, that 6 millimeters turns into a few inches. That is significantly better chance of getting your picture in focus. Item number 2, put your ISO on auto. It feels wrong, particularly coming from manual cameras, and what some pros are going to tell you. It's like you should be controlling your ISO and setting that to get the best quality. Well, that was true in the era of DSLRs and image sensors of less than 20 megapixels. But the response and noise response of most image sensors at ISO 25,000, you're still getting clean, usable images. So, you know, you can set an ISO limiter on most cameras to a very high number and still get good images at a much higher ISO. Speeding that ISO up, if you're shooting in auto, you're going to get sharper pictures. Now, speaking about your shutter speed, here's another one that can be tricky. And by tricky, what if you're shooting hand holding, your shutter speed, and if you're manually controlling your shutter speed, and that is the one area I do potentially recommend that you do set manually, although it depends on your situation. If you're shooting on a tripod, auto's fine. If you're hand holding, set your shutter speed manually. And a lot of people ignore this. I've seen professionals ignore this, and then they miss a picture. So to not do that, what you want to do, so I have an 85 millimeter lens currently on this camera. So I want to make sure that my shutter speed is at least twice the focal length of my lens, particularly with a high resolution sensor. 24 megapixel or higher, yeah, you want to obey that, because the sensors are now every bit as good as or better than for 35 millimeter film. So when you have this, the shutter speed on your lens matters because it stills motion. Some other practical tips are, if you're shooting people, you generally want to shoot at a shutter speed of at least 1/250th of a second. Don't go slower than that. Because even if you are steady and your camera is steady, and even using a tripod, the person that you're shooting is going to move slightly. Their heartbeat, their breathing makes them move. Everybody moves. If you're shooting at 1/250th of a second, you're stilling and you're capturing fast enough to filter out that movement, because that's what you're doing, is you're, in essence, you're shooting fast enough that any motion is filtered out. Now, some of this is also going to depend on the focus speed of your camera and how good the focus is on your camera. So if you find that you're shooting at 1/250th of a second and you're still picking up a slight blur in your images, the face is just slightly out of focus, increase your speed to at least 1/400th of a second, maybe even 1/500th of a second. Some of that's going to depend on the camera that you're using. And there's nothing wrong with shooting at 1/1000th of a second. Now, if you're shooting at 1/1000th of a second and you have your depth of field set to say f5.6 and you don't have a whole lot of light in your scene, as a lot of us do when we're shooting in our own homes, that's where you want your ISO to be set off to auto to compensate for that lack of light. So that's why I say put your ISO on auto, leave it there. Don't worry, it's fine. It's okay. If you're shooting wildlife, you're going to want to shoot at 1/1000th of a second at all times or higher. Somewhere between 1/1000th and 1/4000th is probably going to be required. And, and that's if your camera's capable of 1/4000th of a second. Some cameras only do like 1/2000th of a second. Older film cameras, a lot of them only went to like 1/800th of a second. So those cameras aren't appropriate for shooting wildlife. And that's just kind of how it is. Now, that doesn't mean you can't shoot wildlife with that. Just you need to expect some motion blur in your images. Other things to be aware of. If you're shooting outside and there's wind, any landscape photographer will tell you wind is one of their worst enemies, because it's not just the risk to the camera, it's the fact that it's going to introduce blur into their images. There's some things you can do to try to mitigate that. Reposition yourself into an area that's got more cover. Depending on the tripod you're using, some tripods have a hook on the bottom of the center pole. That is so you can attach a weight to the tripod, which then allows your tripod to become steadier and more stable during windy conditions. So something to be aware of and something to look for. If you're shooting a lot of landscapes, you might want to find one of those tripods that have the hook on it. Likewise, you can also potentially modify an existing tripod if it doesn't, where you can put weight on it. And that can include anything that's as just a matter of putting a cord around it and taking a soda or a water bottle and tying it to your tripod. That'll give you just a little bit more stabilization to your image. And again, if you're shooting in an area that has significant rocks, that can actually fix your situation as well. You just set your camera on the rock instead of a tripod, because odds are the rock's not going to be affected by the wind. So those are the things that you can do easily with just a small amount of thought. Put your ISO to auto, make your shutter speed fast, and use the larger depth of field. If you're shooting outside, you're going to want to set f8 between f8 and f11. Use a tripod, use a monopod. I highly recommend monopods. Monopods are so useful, and it's one of the cheapest investments you can make in your camera kit. um, you know, and shoot fast enough. You know, if you have a camera that was made within the last 5 years, odds are your camera is going to have a fast enough shutter speed to fix any of your focus issues. Now, going into camera details, yes, there's back button autofocus, which can help if you're shooting handheld most of the time. There's different focus modes that can also help. Um, you know, if you're shooting people or animals, you might want to set your camera to continuous focus mode. Some of that depends on the camera. I've had some cameras, they don't focus fast enough to rely on continuous autofocus. So, something to consider. You can try it, test it out, have somebody move around while you're in continuous autofocus. Otherwise, just use single autofocus. The back button autofocus, what that does is it helps control some of the motion, um, and you're not half pressing the shutter button. Instead, you press that button to achieve focus, and you can press it down and just hold it and then take your picture. Um, so there's that. But if you set back button autofocus, you probably should disable the half shutter press focus. Some cameras do that automatically when you turn on back button autofocus. Some do not. So this varies by camera. Other things you can do. Use electronic shutter as opposed to mechanical shutter, because that shutter closing can introduce a small amount of camera shake. If you have IBIS in your camera and or lenses, sometimes that can help, sometimes it doesn't. From what I'm hearing is like the Canon R5 apparently suffers a small vibration from the mechanical shutter. So that's something where you might want to disable the quote unquote first shutter curtain and shoot electronic shutter. And that just eliminates the mechanical shutter from being the issue. Other things you can use to help is the take it off of auto detect autofocus, use subject detect autofocus. Depending on the camera, this camera actually has not just eye detect autofocus for people, but it has it for animals as well. And that's generally pretty nice. But if your depth of field is not deep enough, it's not going to help. Anyway, so that is a recommended setting. Use a tripod when possible, or statically set your camera somewhere and use the timer. Something I really, really love about this camera, some cameras you have to go into the menu system to set a timer. This camera actually has a timer on the dial. I have my camera set, I turn the dial to the timer, I have it on my tripod, I press the button, 5 seconds later, boom, it takes the picture. And all the shake from pushing the shutter button is gone. On older cameras like the Canon DSLRs, there's actually a setting where you can tell the camera to flip the mirror up before it takes the picture. So if you're on a significant budget, and let's say you have a Canon 5D Mark II, or even the original Canon 5D, look for the mirror lockup. Turn the mirror lockup on, and set your timer. And what happens is when you initially push the shutter button, the mirror locks up before the timer initiates. So that removes that vibration from taking your pictures. So just a tip from the old school DSLR cameras. That's pretty much all the tricks there are. Um, you know, and some cameras are much better. And by better, I do mean faster autofocusing systems. Um, and those help, but the big things is the basics, just as in the old days of shooting film, and that's your depth of field, your ISO, and your shutter speed. If you don't set those correctly, you can set everything else and still fail. So keep your ISO on auto, shoot your shutter speed as fast as you can, and set your depth of field appropriately for what you're shooting. Indoors, shoot f4, f5.6, maybe even take it up to f8 to help you get that depth of field. If you're outside, definitely shoot f8 to f11. You can go past f11, although you start introducing different potential issues depending on the lens that you have and the quality of lens that you have, because you'll introduce different effects that you may not want in your images. So that's it. And I hope you find this information useful. There's a lot of people who have really good information on all of these exact things. Some are a little less comprehensive than others. You know, one photographer will say, hey, back button autofocus solves all my focusing issues. Well, his shooting style may only be hand holding. He might never use a tripod. So back button autofocus is a great fix for him, but it doesn't mean a whole lot if you're shooting on a tripod and you're still getting blurry photos. If you're shooting on a tripod and you're getting blurry photos, then odds are it's not the back button autofocus that you're going to have to fix. You're going to have to fix your shutter speed, your depth of field, and your ISO. So ISO auto, depth of field sufficient, so you have enough area in focus, and make sure your shutter speed to freeze motion. Now, all that being said, something to realize is you do not have to have 100% perfectly in focus picture to have a successful picture. Some of the most famous street photographers, some of their best pictures are out of focus. And it's very interesting because it is subjective. If you're shooting a waterfall, sometimes landscape photographers set intentionally a slow shutter speed to capture that motion. So those are areas you can play with if you want to play in the creative side of photography. Now if you're shooting weddings, you're not going to want to do that. But if you're shooting landscapes, by all means. If you're shooting wildlife, you might want to see the blur of a bird's wings, or you might want to freeze. In the case of shooting like hummingbirds, typically speaking, you're always going to have blur because of how fast they beat their wings. But if you have a camera that can do a 4,000th of a second, or if you have an electronic shutter where you can go beyond that, some of those cameras out there, I think there's one that does 1/20,000th of a second. That's in the pro level cameras, not the very technical specific high speed cameras. Um, so it you know it's going to depend on the capabilities of your camera, but you can freeze the motion of that, and that's kind of cool. When something that you normally see that's always blurry, and all of a sudden you freeze that motion, that's kind of cool. You know, same thing when you're shooting water. Um, a landscape photographer will do a slow uh, shutter speed to capture motion of a waterfall because it has a more pleasing appearance to the eye. However, nothing says you can't shoot a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion if you're getting interesting splashes that want to be captured. Likewise, if you're shooting um, a lake um, and there's wind and you're getting ripples across the water that are distracting from your image, you can you can slow that shutter speed down to smooth that water out and make that look really nice. So how you're shooting and what you're shooting is also going to dictate some of the things that you want to consider. So anyway, I'm basically rambling at this point and going beyond what we should be talking about. So anyway, uh, think about those things. Make sure, like I said, put your ISO to auto. Make sure your shutter speed is fast enough. Make sure your depth of field is large enough. Um, and you will achieve beautifully in focus images all the time once you master and practice those skills. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content of this video, please hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next week.